Corey Atchison has been in prison for 28 years for a murder he swears he did not commit. He says he has spent almost every day of it trying to prove his innocence.
Was there a point over the last 20-plus years where you thought, I'm gonna die here?
Times when you get denied in court, you feel low. You just want to say give sometimes.
Corey's daughter, Courtney, was born a couple of months after her father started his life sentence.
It felt like I was failing her. And it felt like it wasn't even my fault.
A 2017 study of the National Exoneration Registry shows that innocent black people are 7 times more likely to be convicted of murder than innocent white people. Tulsa defense lawyer Joe Norwood was convinced Corey was one of them. He tracked down a man who said police threatened him with jail time when he was 15 years old if he didn't say Corey was the shooter.
Partway through his testimony, he goes, "What I just testified to isn't the truth. I was told to say it by these detectives. I didn't see Corey do anything."
While Corey languished in prison, another North Tulsa man named Malcolm Scott had insisted for more than 20 years that he, too, had been convicted of murder based on Corey's testimony. Unbelievably, Malcolm was Corey's younger brother.
Did you know that your brother told us that he feels partly responsible for you going to prison?
I mean, there's no blame on my brother at all. And I definitely can't hold him responsible for something that I didn't even do myself.
Tulsa police denied they coerced any witnesses, but when witnesses against Malcolm also recanted, it was time for both brothers to have another day in court.
We basically had made that a pact with each other. We said, man, whoever get out of here first, you better come get the other one.
You can watch the whole story tonight on Dateline at 10 p.m. Eastern on NBC and on NBC News Now this weekend.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.